Ladies and gentlemen, once again, please welcome AMO President Gary McNamara.
All right, thank you. I think it's very safe to say that everyone in this plenary hall has a deep interest in polling, public interest and public priorities. We couldn't ask for a better speaker to be with us this morning than Nik Nanos. He is one of the most respected public opinion pollsters that can map the political, economic, and social trends that influence us in our communities. Nik Nanos is the president and CEO of Nanos Research, founded in 1987. He is a recognized leader in the public opinion research industry in Canada. He is regularly called upon by senior corporate and political decision makers to conduct research and to provide strategic counsel. You have likely seen his polling work related to federal provincial elections, as well as his weekly tracking of consumer confidence, the Bloomberg Nanos Canadian Confidence Index. Over the years, Nik has done polling for AMO. If you were at the 2014 AMO conference in London, Ontario, you will remember that Nik shared his narrative on public's thoughts on municipal governments and our services. Well, today we have invited him back, as he has done recent work looking at how things have changed since then, and to provide some insight on how the public feels about the future. Please help me welcome Nik Nanos to the stage.
Thanks, Gary, for that kind introduction. You know, I was here for the previous presentation, and I don't know if I sum it up. Was it a bit gloomy? Yeah, I think $3 billion in gloominess in terms of the shortfall, and I was kind of worried when I listened to the previous presentation, and then I was reminded of what the title was for my presentation, which was, if I can read it, Taking the Pulse of Ontarians. And you know, when a doctor takes a pulse, it's usually not good news. Now, that being said, what I'm going to be doing today is presenting some polling that we did on behalf of the AMO. You'll be, I guess, drinking from the statistical fire hose, so to speak. The good news is that my understanding is that you will be, all delegates and representatives will be emailed a copy of my deck. So don't worry about squinting when you see the charts. You will get a copy, and I understand that it eventually will also be posted on the AMO website. So, and I'll tell you from the get-go, I guess I have to say a number of things. First of all, it's kind of like my standard legal disclaimer. All views expressed are those of Nik Nanos and not of the AMO or anyone else. And second of all, I'll tell you, I am more interested in the dialogue or questions that you might have arising from the numbers that I'm going to present today, because the reality is I'm very familiar with the numbers, but I'm interested in any questions that you might have. So if you have questions, I understand there are mics. Please write them down so that we can include that as part of the end of the session. So, what was my objective? My objective was basically to get into the mind of Ontarians. How do they feel about municipalities? What are the challenges that average residents in Ontario think of when they think of municipalities? What priorities are important to them? And probably the most important thing, how do we move forward? And when I go through this presentation, I want you to think of three things. I want you to think, first of all, of the concept of proximity and how close municipalities and local government is to the day-to-day lives of Ontarians and what that means. Second of all, I want you to think about priorities as a key takeaway. And finally, and most importantly, I want you to think of the ask. And you know, if anyone's a politician, you're used to that. The ask is support, whether it's for yourself or for an initiative or for a campaign, but to think of a potential ask. And I guess I've got the easy job. My easy job is to tell you what Ontarians think, to give you my interpretation, and then to leave it with you to try to figure it out. Now, when we get to the survey that we did, We did a random telephone survey earlier this summer. It was comprised of 1,000 Ontarians. And just as a point of reference, this is the exact same methodology that we use whenever we do election tracking for CTV News and the Globe and Mail. It's kind of the Nanos, tried and true methodology that has served us well for 25 years. So the interesting thing about this particular survey, just from a methodological point of view, and this is where you would probably be interested in taking a look at the report, is that we did oversampling, or had a sampling plan to have what I'll say better samples or more robust samples for smaller parts of the province, so that there were basically equivalent samples in each of the 5 regions, and then we weighted them to be representative of the province. This would allow people to have a little bit of a flavor to see if there's any difference in opinion, for example, from Southern Ontario versus Northern Ontario versus Eastern Ontario. Now, I talked about proximity, and we have to think of proximity in terms of people's relationship to different levels of government and how close or not close they might be. This is a tracking question. The good news is that for a number of these questions we've asked them before, so we have 2014 data and 2016 data. And the good news is that when you look at this, is that municipalities currently in Ontario are the hands-down winner when it comes to people saying which level of government is the most responsive to them. 4 out of every 10 Ontarians or thereabouts say municipalities, and you can see 26% say the provincial government, 18% say the federal government is the most responsive. It's been steady since 2014. But look at the changes over the last 2 years. Back in 2014, it was basically a tie between the provincial government and the municipal level of government. The other thing to point out is that we don't use politicians' names or party names in this. We're basically talking about levels of government. So you can see in 2014, it's basically a tie, 34% and 37% between provinces and municipalities. But over the last 2 years, we've seen an 8-point drop in terms of the proportion of Ontarians that say that provinces are the most responsive to them, and a 5-point gain since 2014. The key takeaway is that when voters think of responsive government today, it's not the feds, it's not the province, it's clearly municipalities. But you know, what I found interesting, and this goes back to kind of testing on the different subgroups, different regions of the province, different types of residents, are the variations of opinion. And when we slice the data, so this is the same question except sliced by region, you can see no big difference between men and women, not really a big difference based on age, but check out regions. You can see that when we ask about municipal government, the North actually is a bit of an outlier. And just to put this into context, every region with the exception of the North identified the municipal level of government as the most responsive. In the North, it was the provincial government. 35% of Ontarians that live in the North identified the province, followed by 29% for the municipality and 17% for the federal government. So the one outlier there, and perhaps this particular measure has to do with how big a community is, but the one interesting thing is that on this particular measure, municipalities win hands down everywhere except in the North, where they're still competitive, but they trail the province. So what's on the minds of Ontarians when we talk about possible priorities? And for those of you that have worked with me in the past, you'll know that I'm a big believer in open-ended questions. You know, in research, there's 2 types of questions, open and closed-ended. The open-ended questions are the questions where people can say anything that they like, right? There's nothing prompted, nothing introduced. In this particular case, the open-ended question was, what is the biggest problem facing your municipality? So you can see that core priorities related to infrastructure ranked top in both waves of research. You can see budget funding is up about 4 points, but the reality is that what we see here is that in terms of the top problem facing municipalities, it still remains infrastructure. We find that any of the polling that we've done nationally and in the province of Ontario and other provinces, infrastructure is on the top of mind of many Canadians. But the big question is not what the priorities are. The big question is, how do we pay or how do we fund these priorities? And we did an interesting question that we've tracked for the last couple of years for the AMO. And in this question, basically, we tell respondents the fact that the federal government gets 51% of every household tax dollars, the province 40%, municipalities get 9%. And then we ask whether this is about right, whether municipalities should receive a greater share, or whether they should receive a smaller share of this tax revenue. So think of it this way. About 1 out of every 20 Ontarians say you should get a smaller share of tax dollars. And as an aside, that's about the same number who believe that Elvis is still alive. But 1 out of every 4 say that it's about right, but you can see 2 out of every 3 believe that municipalities should get a greater share of tax dollars. And this is up 5 percentage points over the last 2 years. And to put this into context, people are 16 times more likely to say municipalities should get more than less. They're 3 times more likely to say that municipalities should get more than the same. And it's basically a recognition that municipalities deliver critical services which are important to residents, and that municipalities are under stress. And when we break out, the appetite, and these are kind of the demographic numbers, similar numbers you can see between men and women on this issue, but look at that age group, 30 to 50-year-old Ontarians, much more likely to say that municipalities should have a greater share. This is kind of like the key group in terms of homeowners, families, businesses, people in the community that have a stake, people that are property taxpayers. And just so you know, I'm not pressing the button when you see it blink. But anyways, the key takeaway here is that there is a higher level of appetite among middle-aged voters. And geographically, you can see in the north, there is a greater appetite at 76%, and also in Toronto compared to other regions. So the key learning here about this idea of share of tax dollars is about direction. And think of it this way, if Ontarians were looking at rebalancing the Federation and rebalancing funding and looking how things work, it is very clear that if they knew who got what, knowing who does what, that they would, by a significant margin, be more likely to say that municipalities should get a greater share of tax revenue. So, we also asked about priorities for investing in municipal property tax revenue. And in this particular question, we asked what the first and second priorities should be in their community. So you can see infrastructure, still quite important. In terms of immediate investment priorities, you can see that it's actually increased about 8 points over the last year. The other thing is, in terms of second-level magnitude of spending priorities, social services is up about 9 points over the last 2 years. So you have to think of what I'll say these investments and spending that people want in terms of not just bricks and mortar, but also investment in people. So the big question is how? We've talked about what people think about municipalities in terms of how responsive that they are compared to other levels of government. We've talked about the challenges that they think are there. We've talked about the priorities in terms of investment. How do we pay for this? And I'll tell you, this is the most important slide and the one that's the hardest to read. That's my fault. Font size. So what we did was, in association with the AMO, we created a list of possible ideas to generate revenue. List including new employer payroll tax, a municipal fuel tax, land transfer tax, parking lot tax, tax on income of businesses, a new general income tax, and then also the HST. So let's start off with the initial reaction. People don't like new taxes. Actually, most of these were unpopular. In fact, a majority of Canadians, of Ontarians that is, were opposed to every single concept right across the board. And that's why you see those great big swaths of red, right? Red means we don't like these types of tax increases. There's one that was tied, and that was a new tax on businesses. About the same number of people agreed or somewhat agreed compared to somewhat disagreeing or disagreeing outright, 48 and 48. Although the level of intensity for disagreement was much higher. But the interesting thing, and I'll tell you this was the thing that surprised me most about the study that we did for the AMO, is that a majority of Ontarians liked the idea of an HST hunt. And if I can put this into context, there's a famous story in polling circles. I'm not sure how appropriate this is, but I'll tell you it anyways. The federal government was introducing the GST, and they're doing a focus group. They're doing a focus group with people, asking them about, because what percentage should the GST be, right? So they're testing on different numbers. Should it be 7%? Should it be 10%? Should it be 5%? Should it be 9%? They're testing on different numbers. And one of the focus groups, one of the participants, and I think he was from southwestern Ontario even, said, okay, you're talking about, whether this new tax should be 5%, 6%, 7%, 8%, or 9%. And he said, that's kind of like asking me, how many hammer blows to the head would I prefer? Because I'm dead after the first hammer blow. But the reality is that for anyone in the know, for example, on the public policy front, the rollback, a 1% change in the GST, either an increase or a decrease, can be easily absorbed by the Canadian economy. It might sound like a lot, but for a lot of these economists, they kind of call it a rounding error. People will take the cut if they're given to it, but at the same time, they will pay for it. And what's quite interesting here is that when you look at these numbers, and I will circle around again to this whole concept of the HST, is that a majority support a 1 percentage point increase, whether it's related to kind of being able to hold property tax at the rate of inflation, or whether it's connected to having a dedicated fund for infrastructure. And why? Well, and I think it's because of the perceived role of municipalities on the infrastructure front and the critical role. And if you think of a political slam dunk, if we were doing messaging, a lot of times I'm dealing with clients and they're trying to kind of communicate with people and identify the best way for them to for residents and voters to understand things. And, one of the, this would be any infrastructure that is done for safety is basically a political slam dunk. This is kind of like the equivalent of, if your son or daughter was sick, you'd say, listen, just do it. Right? You're not going to quibble with what the price is. If we need this, this is critical. It's part of our community. It's part of being a healthy and strong community. Just do it. So, one of the things to think of is that there are different levels of magnitude of infrastructure. If there's any kind of component related to safety, it's actually at the top of the pecking list with people the least likely to ask any questions. However, when we test on, for example, cutting services or freezing property taxes, it kind of shifts from kind of what I'll say a bright green light to perhaps a red light. And it's kind of, we see lots of polls out there, and a lot of polls, they ask questions like, would you like your property taxes to go down? Well, everybody puts up their hand. Everybody wants their property taxes to go down. But the key here is explaining what I'll say trade-offs. Trade-offs between property taxes and services. And the idea is to get behind those. So we tested on support for cutting services to freeze property taxes. And you can see that it is a resounding no, by a margin of 2-1. Almost 2 out of every 3 Ontarians would oppose, or some would oppose, cutting services to freeze property taxes, while only about 3 out of every 10 would support that. And you know, there's interesting, when you look at the demographic tables, you know, the group least likely to want to see those services cut are seniors. And you know, when we think of kind of the whole scope of services that are provided, I want to kind of take a moment to put a spotlight on something that Pat had identified before related to perceptions on how much police and firefighters get paid in Ontario. And you know, the reality is that whenever anyone does a survey, you know, those surveys on, you know, which people in occupations do you trust or respect the most, police and firefighters are rightly at the top of the list. The reality is they're the people that are between you and harm's way, or they're the people that are saving your life. So it shouldn't be a big surprise that whenever they're in the public domain, that they have a significant level of goodwill. But, are you happy that I have a but? No? Okay, anyways, not. You know what I mean. We tested on perceptions related to wage increases for both police personnel and firefighters. And we presented 3 options. One option was to have increases to wages and benefits the same as other employees within a municipality. That's the dark blue. Then we had the same increase as other police and firefighting personnel across the province. That's the medium blue, that's hard to read. And then the third was an outright freeze, freezing the wages and benefits of police and firefighting personnel. You can see about 1 out of every 4 Ontarians outright would support a freeze, no increase whatsoever. But look at the change in the last 2 years. You can see that the appetite or the perception that increases should be linked to whatever happens in a specific municipality has increased from 32 to 41%, a 9-point increase, while the provincial model has dropped 5 points. So, you know, the lesson is that you can see 2 years ago when we were talking about this, is that it was basically a tie between people who said that it should be municipally based versus provincially based. But even with all their wants and priorities and their belief that municipalities are responsive, we should not forget one dark cloud that hangs over Ontarians. Property tax increase. And when you look at how concerned Ontarians are, whether they're young or old, whether they're in one part of the province or another, you can see that 86% of Ontarians are outright concerned or somewhat concerned about property tax increases, while only 13% are not concerned or somewhat not concerned. And that this cuts across, it doesn't make any difference whether you're a man, woman, whether you're in the north or the south or in Toronto, whether you're young or old. You know, the concern is 6.5 times more intense than the lack of concern. So think of it this way, if you're talking with a resident, and I don't really need to tell you this because you've had these conversations, and you say, we need to invest in this, then it's like, okay, what's that going to mean for property taxes? Oh, we need to spend money on this program. What does this mean for property taxes, right? We need a new initiative. What does this mean? And people responding, what does this mean for property taxes? We have to think of the primary frame of everything that people see in the news about the things that municipalities need to do with one simple question. People saying, okay, I understand that. What does it mean for property taxes? And this is why, the discussion about sustainable revenue is quite important. And even when you think about the property tax fixation, there's another concern. Just with outright maintenance, you can see 3 out of every 4 Ontarians are concerned or somewhat concerned that there will not be the property tax revenue or the revenue to cover what we need to do just to maintain the infrastructure that we know that we're going to need. And this pops up to 9 out of every 10 Ontarians who are 30 to 39 years of age. So let's circle around for a moment. We've established the connection between residents and municipalities in terms of responsiveness. We've established the priorities. We've talked about the concerns. We've initially looked at some revenue options, but let's turn around again and take a look at those HST numbers. So, when you look at this, and this is the slide that shows that about 6 out of every 10 Ontarians would support or somewhat support a 1% increase in the HST to be solely dedicated to municipal governments if you knew it would be used only for infrastructure projects in your community. You can see that this is kind of what I'll say is the dedicated revenue message option. If we were to kind of package this, this is what you would say. The second question, I'll call it message 2, or message option 2, is a 1% increase in HST if it would allow for your municipalities to hold property tax increases at a rate of inflation. The key takeaway, it doesn't matter how you slice it, or how you dice it, or how you package it, a majority of Ontarians support this 1% increase. That the concept of a 1% increase in the HST to help municipalities, whether it's to combat rising property taxes, whether it's to invest in infrastructure, whether it's to deliver the programs that Ontarians want, is a winner. People are more likely to understand that. And, it's one of those things where, it's fairly clear. It's just one of the, I would kind of say it's, if you kind of, if the municipality said we're going to have a new tax on parking, I always kind of tell my clients, you have to think about what is intuitively true, or what people think is intuitively true, kind of what passed the gut test. The gut test, I think, for average Ontarians is that for many of these measures, a parking tax, a tax on payroll, so forth, that it's hard for them to understand, thinking about the magnitude of what's needed, whether those can actually do the job. I want to shift gears and put one other idea on the table for you to kick around. And that has to do with what might happen in the next municipal election. We're not going to talk about federal and provincial elections, but municipally. And we saw in the last federal election a record turnout. And I know from a research perspective, I asked myself, okay, so more people were engaged in the last federal election. Is this an isolated incident, or is this potentially indicative of a greater level of potential participation at the provincial and municipal level? Are younger people starting to get more engaged? Will they necessarily come out and vote? And, there's a big discussion in the community about how to get people to vote, or why people vote. And, it's interesting looking at the provincial election in the province of Quebec that, back in 2008 in the province of Quebec, in the election that Jean Charest lost to Pauline Marois, there was a voter turnout, the previous one that is, the one that he won, there was a voter turnout of 57%. And then in the 2012 provincial election in Quebec, there was a 75% increase in voter turnout. Actually, the research showed that younger people came out to vote. They basically exclusively accounted for the increase in the voter turnout. And, the key takeaway here is that in Ontario, you can see that over those same periods, they had very low levels of voter turnout in the 50s. And even in the last election in Ontario, it was only 52%. Now I'm going to show you a slide that I know you will question. Let me explain. We asked people about their likelihood to vote in municipal elections in 2014 and in 2016. Now, a couple things. First of all, I don't know if many of you have probably heard of the halo effect, right? The halo effect are people who say, yeah, I'm going to vote, and they don't vote. Yeah, I pay my taxes. They don't pay taxes. Yeah, I recycle everything at the house. They don't recycle stuff, right? So people over-report things that they think that they should be doing. But actually, the critical thing here is not the number, because I know that those numbers are high, because whenever we ask those questions are high. The purpose of this is actually to track the change. Now, they're marginally two different questions, but the question, I think what I would like to put on the table for you to think about is that perhaps in the next municipal election in Ontario, there could be a higher voter turnout than usual. It could be a spin-off from the federal election and people feeling more engaged. It's also probably a likelihood as a result of a lot of the issues that Ontarians deem as very important falling into the municipal bailiwick. So, this is my last slide. Where are we? You can see when we ask Ontarians, infrastructure is both a problem and a priority. They see municipalities as part of the solution, agile, lean, responsive organizations. They're concerned that property taxes will not cover future costs of infrastructure. They believe that Ontarians think you should get a greater share. And I'd like to say, I didn't see Pat's slides before today, but you can see that if you ask average Ontarians, they're actually on the same page. Now, at the beginning, I talked about thinking about three things: proximity, priorities, and the ask. The good news is that you're very well positioned. Your priorities are important. People want action. They see you as responsive. The ask would be a big one. And I think it's kind of ironic that prompted with small asks, I don't know, it sounds like Goldilocks, small asks, medium asks, and large asks. Asks, I'd like to say. That actually Ontarians opted for the biggest, most difficult ask. They didn't opt for the easy one. They didn't opt for, let's have a tax on parking, right? Or let's have a land transfer tax, or let's have a fuel tax. They're kind of like, let's go big or go home. And that is the one that had the majority of traction. So realistically, for municipalities in Ontario, there are three paths forward. The status quo, and I'll tell you, if you ask average Ontarians who are not experts, they know that that's not going to work. The status quo will not work. Second, the small ask, right? Parking, payroll, land transfer, fuel tax. And I would hazard to say, and this is my personal view, if you go down this path, you're just going to annoy people and you're not going to achieve what you want to do. Because people are going to say, you want to do this? And how is this going to help us maintain and build the infrastructure and municipal services that we're going to need? We're going to do this off a parking lot or off a fuel tax? So I would say that instinctively, those smaller asks, people will not believe. They will think, yeah, they're going to put this small tax on, and then property taxes will still go up, right? So I would say, if I may suggest, don't annoy voters by going small. because then you're just going to get mired in trying to defend how the small ask will actually accomplish what voters want. And then there's the third path. The third path is the HST. The upside is that the HST has been reduced, so it's not as if the HST would be moving into new territory for many voters, and that linking municipalities to the HST, linking municipalities and their needs in terms of a fair and appropriate, sustainable share of tax revenue to deliver services and programs and to build infrastructure is probably going to make a lot more sense. It could actually even make the HST potentially more popular because it's actually going to go to something, right? You know, whenever we do polling, people hate things going into the general consolidated revenue fund. They like to think that things are going to something. So perhaps you can think of it also not just in terms of what is good from a public policy perspective, not just in terms of what might be fair in terms of revenue, not just in terms of what actually could work that people could understand in a fairly simple way, but also in terms of a potential proposal that can engage Canadians and Ontarians especially in a way that they feel that it could make a difference. Because you know what? It's like one of those things where people don't mind, believe it or not, when we do polling, people don't mind paying taxes. They just don't want it wasted. And they actually like to see what their taxes are being paid, what it goes towards. So, you know, I would say that the concept or a dialogue on 1% of the HST going to municipalities is a good fit in terms of understandability for residents. It's a good fit in terms of transparency. It's a good fit in terms of people paying taxes and knowing where it's going to go. And it's a good fit in terms of a logical ask that people say, hey, this might actually just work. So now my closing comment is the tough part is actually in your hands. You have to figure out how to intersect this public opinion research with good public policy. And with that, I leave it in your hands. Thank you for your attention. So I don't know if I have any questions, but I won't be offended if you have no questions. But, are there any questions about any of the crazy things or sane things that I've said or any of the polling? Uh-oh.
Well, you asked.
Yes.
Nick, it's Jeff Lehman, the mayor of the city of Barrie. Nice to see you, and thanks. A fascinating presentation, potential way forward on what's next in Ontario. I actually want to ask you about your turnout comments and municipal elections. So the first part of my question is why, given your first slide, if we're the most responsive level of government, if people are so concerned about municipal issues, why is our turnout the lowest?
Okay.
And the second part of the question is, I know you're a major commentator on the national and provincial political scene. What do they do differently that you think causes turnout to be higher, and what can we do differently to drive out turnout?
Okay, so there's been actually a lot of research done in this, and there's two ways. Change elections. Let's look at it in the reverse. What makes for high turnout in elections? People wanting change. People thinking that the system is messed up. Do you know what? If municipalities were messed up and screwed up, more people would come out and vote because they'd be very angry. No, I'm just saying. Now, the other thing is in the research, the Quebec election was actually quite interesting. Because what the research suggested, and you know, many times they talk about how to get young people to vote. And the popular wisdom, and I do not agree with the popular wisdom is that we should communicate with young people about voting in the same way we tell them about having their annual medical checkup or brushing their teeth. That you should do it. It's good for democracy. It's part of growing up. What the research that I've done and been focused on shows that self-interest gets young people or no different from people of any other age group. So what was the one difference in those two Quebec elections? Tuition fees. So think of it this way. If you're a young person and the election is about property taxes, income taxes, and health care, And if you're 25 years old and you don't pay income taxes and you don't own a home and you're healthy, why would you vote? What's relevant to you? I think one of the things, I would say in terms of a strategy, if you wanted to encourage young people to vote and be engaged in municipal politics, I would say quite simply that you shouldn't do an education campaign like, this is good for you. You should put a spotlight on municipal services that young people use and get them to be engaged in those services, whether it's recreational services, health services, social services, all those types of things, right? Green spaces, and focus on those, because if you make the topic or content of the dialogue relevant to them, then they're going to come out and vote. But if the election is about property tax freeze, they're just like anyone else. They're not necessarily going to vote. Is that helpful?
Thanks.
Good. We'll go here. You go mic number 2.
Thank you, sir. That's a good presentation. I enjoyed it immensely. Thinking back several years ago to when Mr. Harper dropped the GST by 1%, I think we were told that was $1 billion in revenue. Are you proposing a GST increase or a PST increase? And do you have any idea what the number would be dollar-wise?
Mm-hmm. So we didn't, in the question that we asked related to the HST, I think something like this would be something for you to kind of work out with. The reality is, I don't want to say I'm just the monkey asking the question, but the reality is that we tested on the concept of a 1% increase to the HST. How that works is for, I think, the AMO and municipalities to engage the provincial and federal government on how that would work. But I think it was, is it $6 billion? It's about $6 billion in revenue. Is that what that's nationally, of course, is what that would represent. And Ontario would obviously get the biggest portion of that.
Thank you.
Okay.
Good day, thank you. Also a good presentation. Question I ask is, you defined at the end there that Ontarians are concerned about waste.
Waste.
What's your definition of waste? And what do you think that they're telling, what is their definition of waste?
Oh, okay. So we didn't ask that specific question, but we've done a lot of research on waste and inefficiency, and you should know that the default position is that everyone thinks that there's waste and inefficiency in the system. I think part of the challenge for municipalities is that people think that it's a little more apparent because the government is so close to them. But when people generally think of waste, they're usually talking about administration, right? In terms of where they think. It's kind of like one of those things where whenever we'd ask people on areas to cut, even if you had the leanest, meanest administrative structure, they would still say, cut the administrative structure. So I think that's probably a good message that, for municipalities, advancing the view and making sure that people know how lean municipalities are in terms of their administration is probably critical. Okay.
Thanks.
Thanks. Good. Great. So I think we're done. Oh, sorry.
Sorry, Leo Malash, town of Amherstburg. We hear a lot about the aging population. I just read last week about that in 2015, there were more people over 65 years of age than there are under 15 years of age, and it's impacting our schools and everything. I just wonder if you did any research looking at what the aging population is really going to demand in the next 20 years in terms of from municipal services.
Yeah, it's actually going to be, I think one of the things that I always tell people is life is not a straight line trajectory, right? Just because something happened now doesn't mean that it's going to happen in the future. But there are some fundamental kind of game-changing attitudes among millennials who are less likely to want to own a car, who delay purchasing who are delaying home purchasing, all those decisions are going to have a significant impact on the municipal infrastructure that we're going to need in the future. Because if millennials, when they retire, if fewer of them have cars or want to drive, that means that they're going to want public transit, right? If fewer of them actually own a home, that means that even in retirement, that means that there are going to be other kind of changes in behavior related to the mix of renters versus owners in a particular community. But, I think probably the biggest challenge would be how you talk to them, and probably the current Prime Minister is probably a case in point. He understands that people feel that they're connecting to others through social media. They feel that they're participating in democracy by pressing a like button or by tweeting or retweeting something. And probably, I would say probably the biggest change in terms of municipalities is going to be, not only are you now on the front line, but multiply that in terms of how engaged your residents are actually going to be. And that's going to be good, and that's also going to be tough.
Thank you.
Hi. I understand in the UK that municipalities have more of a regional role. In fact, they have, how should I say, commissions or panels that look at school locations and whether a school is going to close. And they look at it in the whole neighborhood or community context rather than being disassociated, how we have our system here. And even hospital locations. And I'm wondering if you've ever done any polls on literally changing the system by, considering examples from other areas that have had much more success.
You mean a poll on eliminating the province of Ontario? Is that is that what you're proposing? Yeah, I don't know. Is the Premier still here? Sorry. No, we haven't asked. I've never done any polling on eliminating one of the orders of government. But I think, one of the things in the United Kingdom is that just because they have one less level, it makes it very different in terms of the interaction between the national government and local government. But, the thing is that, I would say that Ontarians are generally kind of happy or accepting of how things are, but the question is, how can they be better? And how can they be sustainable? And how could they make sense? And that's why I think some sort of transparent initiative related to increasing the HST by 1% for municipal infrastructure and programs is a fairly clear ask that people, even if they're not experts, can think maybe this could make a difference. And maybe could also recognize the increasing and important role that municipalities play in making the day-to-day lives of Ontarians better. Yep. Yes.
They offer penalties for such. Do you know if there's any kind of, through your research in the past, you know if there's any kind of appetite for that in this country?
Mandatory voting? Yeah, we've done some research on that, but I think it would be fair to say that the reality is that for those people that vote, they're going to vote. And in a lot of these countries where there's mandatory voting, there's actually not enforcement. Like they're not going out sending out their parking tickets to people who don't vote. So I would say that people would probably be more interested in talking about and engaging in changes that could actually make an impact on their life. Mandatory voting would, might not be pleasant to say, but is a cosmetic change. Like, I always kind of say, whenever I'm dealing with municipalities, I always tell kind of municipal leaders, how are you making people's lives better? Ask yourself that about everything that you do. And if you're engaging in an activity that is not related to making people's lives better, then it's a second level importance. And I would say that to the federal government and the provincial government and municipal government. So we could talk about democratic reform, but how's it going to make people's lives better when they're worried about jobs and what kind of jobs that their kids are going to have, whether they can walk down the street or whether there's a park for them to go to. So when you do testing on these things, they tend to be popular, but I always kind of say, when you stack them up in terms of, would you like us to focus on this, or would you like us to focus on things that affect your day-to-day life? Those things that affect people's day-to-day lives always, I say this, always win hands down, because whenever people look at a politician, a government, any level, or an election, that's all they're thinking about is, what does this mean to me? They're not thinking about who won the debate. They're not thinking about who has the nicest television ad. They're not thinking about who has the nicest tie or shirt. They're thinking about, what does this mean to me? And I think, it's pretty clear that municipalities are critically important to people, that they recognize them as being very responsive, that they recognize the challenges that you have, and it means something to them because it's right in front of them. And that's why those particular issues have a lot more traction than things like mandatory voting and stuff like that. So good news. Oh, yeah, sorry. Go for it.
That's okay. You're talking about raising the HST so we don't have to raise property taxes. How would you distribute this money? Because when you come out with statements like that, and where they're making municipal decisions and we're not getting the money, we're going to have to raise the taxes. So how would the money be distributed fairly?
Do you remember when I said I had the easy job? I could just tell you what people wanted and I wouldn't have to figure out how it should be done. Yeah. I think but it has to be fairly clear and elegant. It can't be like the Magna Carta. It has to be something, it has to be something fairly clear so that people can understand. And I'll tell you, if you get the ask and it's unclear, then it will fail, right? If you get the ask and it's too broad, it will fail, right? Because, so you need some sort of ask that's fairly clear and work out a plan. I don't know what that plan is, but...
It's a great idea, just that when people come out with these statements, and it's a great idea, because I'm sure most municipalities don't want to raise the property taxes anymore. Having some kind of distribution plan would probably be a great thing, but you're right, it's a great idea, but I would just hate for someone to come out and say it. As you can see, the urban jungle is being advertised again.
Yes.
In Smith Falls, Ontario. I thought I'd take the moment I saw myself on TV. But I think it's a great idea. I'd just like to make sure it's distributed fairly.
The good thing is, think of it this way. Even if you fail, first of all, anyone who's in business knows, if you don't ask, you don't get it. So if you don't ask, it's not going to happen. So you have to decide whether you want to ask or not. And then second of all, even if you fail, you will win. Do you know why? Because you're advancing your agenda about how things need to change. And that's all. Canadians are very practical people. Many times when any types of group comes forward with them, that's all they say. What do you want? Oh, we know this is a problem. What do you want? So if you can articulate what you want in a clear way and have an ask and make it ask, the worst case scenario is what? You say no. But if you can engage Canadians in a dialogue about that, even if you can get 40% of Canadians and Ontarians to come on board in terms of an HST, that's a big step forward. And that maybe you won't succeed in the first go, but that Ontario can take a second run. Perhaps there'll be another federal or provincial government to take another run, but to keep kind of moving forward the idea of a sustainable, stable way for people to get the municipal services and infrastructure that they want. The red light is blinking, so I have to stop. But thank you, everyone, for your attention. Have a great rest of conference.